If you had a microscope and could look at a piece of a leaf, you would see thousands of tiny openings which branch out until the leaf has all of the materials it needs. What happens now?
I don't know if you guys have ever noticed this before, but I'm kind of a nerd, okay? So let's talk about some geeky stuff in After Effects. Now, I will say that I've been working a long time, and I've worked with a lot of different kinds of people. I've worked with people that are primarily artists and designers who know really almost nothing technically about television and video making. And then I've also worked with people who started off as television engineers, like at TV stations, and then transitioned either to become editors or even motion graphics people in some cases. And they know a lot about TV engineering and use terminology that I don't know about, and it's a very wide world here when you get into TV geekery and broadcast nerddom, okay? It's a huge topic, like involving scanning lines and electrons and physics and stuff. So I'm not that kind of nerd, but I've been around a long time, so I definitely want to talk to you guys about a few things that are a little nerdy in After Effects, okay? So the first thing that I'd like to talk about are various aspect ratios and frame rates, okay? So this could be a little bit strange. So in this class, we're always working HD TV, 1920 by 1080 with 29.97 frames per second rate, okay? But that doesn't mean that that's the only size or the only rate there is out there. If you are in After Effects like we are and you hit Command K, you will bring up these composition settings here. And so you've probably looked at these. I know we always use this, right? But for example, right now, I have this set on this web video, 320 by 240, okay? And that's, it's one of these smaller aspect ratios. So these various frame sizes are called aspect ratios, okay? HD TV's aspect ratio is 16:9, okay? Whereas the old SD video, as we'll see, is like a 4:3 box, okay? So that's called an aspect ratio. And the aspect ratio here is 320 by 240. And that's a tiny little box there, right? And you'll notice that the frame rate for web video is 15 frames a second. So let's compare this now to NTSC DV, which is kind of the old SD television standard. So SD stands for standard definition, and HD obviously stands for high definition. And in the past, there was no HD TV. It existed, but I don't think people really started broadcasting, and the big switchover happened sometime in the aughts. Before that, we were dealing with NTSC and PAL. And NTSC, I believe it stands for the North American Television Society Committee or something like that, like some really kind of horrible acronym. And then PAL stands for phased something line, or I don't know. They're really technical, weird terms, okay? But in basic terms, NTSC video was what we used in America and also what was used in Japan. And PAL was used in Europe and in other parts of the world. So that's confusing, right? And NTSC, let me click on this here. NTSC DV is 720 by 480 and 29.97 frames per second. Okay, so the frame rate's the same as HD. And you'll see here I've made a comparative box that's, compares the difference between web video size and aspect ratio to SD video. And what it just looks like to me is the SD video is just basically a bigger version of the web video. Now, SD video came first, and web video was made little because of low bandwidth on the web, right? So it's not like we started with web video and then got bigger at S video, okay, right? 780, 486. Now, the keen After Effects observer might notice that the pixel aspect ratio here is different. Usually when we do stuff in HD TV, we have square pixels. And here we have this other thing, D1/DV NTSC, and then in parentheses, 0.91, which, if that doesn't make you feel geeky, I don't know what does, okay? And let me explain this horrible thing about old standard definition video that I had to deal with for 20 years in my career, okay? Maybe not that long, actually. Is that on a computer, pixels are square, okay? Like if you're in Photoshop and you zoom all the way in, you'll see your pixels and they're squares of color, right? And same with After Effects. The same with anything on a computer, okay? But for some reason, TV pixel aspect ratios were different back then. They were not square. I mean, it was because they came about before computers were a thing. But we had this pixel aspect ratio shift that you had to go through all the time and deal with. And I'll show you that in a second, how horrible that is. I just wanted to mention that, okay? So now, let's look at the next size up, which is the one that we're used to, okay? HD TV 1080 2997, okay? So that's this big, right? And now you can compare pretty easily to the other sizes that we talked about. Now, one thing that the keen After Effects observer will notice is that HD video is a widescreen format. And really, I love that about it. I don't like designing in a box. Like this old SD video, it's basically almost a square. I mean, it's 4:3, but it's much closer to square than HD video. And like, I don't like laying things out in a square. I find that like, you just have a lot more room here, okay? And, you know, what I think is really funny is that, like, now with GIFs and, like, Instagram and stuff, people are, like, really excited about designing for a square again. Well, not this guy. I like widescreen, all right? I think this is a better format for designing in, all right? So now you see here we're at 2997 frames per second and square pixels again, all right? And finally, the last one that I want to show here is kind of the largest and most modern of all the aspect ratios that we have at the moment, which is 4K video. And this is huge. It's 4,096 pixels by 3,112 pixels, okay? And I have to hit OK. I actually have to zoom back so we can see how big this is on my monitor. So we're actually looking at this in 50% of the size. It's really big, okay? It's actually kind of prohibitively large to some degree or other at this moment in time, right? But here you can see kind of nicely laid out that here are, you know, web video, SD video, HD video, and 4K video, which are, you know, primarily the aspect ratios that I've worked with in my career. And I assume as we go forward, 2K and 4K video will just become more of a thing. Let's talk for a second about frame rate again. And let's look at these composition settings again. So the frame rate in, you'll notice, in 4K is 24. And that's also the same frame rate that is used for film. Okay, so when you go see a film in a theater, if anybody still does that, they are projected at 24 frames per second, right? Same as this 4K video. But obviously, in our HD TV videos that we're making, it's 29.97 frames per second, right? So that's a kind of, you know, like that sort of sucks, right? That there's multiple frame rates, yeah? It was even weirder back in the day because NTSC has always been 29.97. And PAL, unfortunately, which we didn't really talk about at all, the European television standard, was larger a little bit, 720 by 576 rather than 720 by 480. And frame rate, unfortunately, for PAL was 25 frames a second, right? Which, you know, I think they did, because it's sort of half of 30, and it's still pretty close to 24. But the conversion between 29.97 and 25 is like, it's a little bit crazy, all right? So that's weird. And a couple other things here. So we also had this NTSC D1 format back in the day too. That was literally like, okay, you can kind of see it here. So it's 720 by 486, right? And regular NTSC DV was 720 by 480. So here, when I hit OK on this, you can see that the difference between these two ratios, these two presets, was 3 pixels on top and 3 pixels on the bottom, which is like, come on, guys. Like, why would you do that to me? Okay, as a motion designer, you used to have to know all these various little stupid formats, okay? Luckily now, HD TV has pretty much taken over everything. Oops. Right? Now you will see that even within the HD TV settings, you have HD TV 25 and you have HD TV 24 as well, okay? HD TV 24 converts easily from film because it's 24 frames a second. HD TV 1080 converts well from old PAL things, I imagine, because it's running at 25. And HD TV 29.97 works for us because our videos always ran 29.97, right? So Yeah, that's definitely a geeky thing to get into, frame rate. And I think it's kind of hard to like visualize this, right? So I've devised a little comp here that I think will help explain this, okay? And what I did is I created 1 second of animation here, all right? Now, again, the keen After Effects observer will notice that, in fact, this comp is 29 frames, not 30, and the last frame of the animation comes at frame 29. So you're thinking to yourself, you're busted, Noel. That's not 1 second, that's only 29 frames. 30 frames is 1 second, basically, right? Well, hotshot, you're wrong. I mean, you're right, but you're wrong, and I'm right, as always, because frame 0 is the first frame, okay? So this is the first frame, that's 0, and then if you want to count, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. until you get up here, which is frame 29, but it's actually the 30th frame that we're looking at. Okay, so there's that. Okay, so I built this 1 second animation, and right now this would play like this, okay? And this is running at 29.97 frames per second, which is what we're used to looking at in this class, okay? So it looks kind of normal or whatever to us. Now, I don't know how this is going to play on the web, but what I want to do is show you a bunch of different frame rates here and explain this. So I'm going to hit Command K. And the first thing let's do is, so here's our frame rates, and we have a ton of things in here too. And let's set this to 8 frames a second, which is kind of the lowest preset that we can work with. And by the way, with all of these, like, you don't need to use any of these presets. What I did here is I just made this weird comp size that is 1036 by 274. Like, you could have something that's 1 pixel high and 1,000 pixels wide or something. You can make whatever size you want, and you can make it whatever frame rate you want too, okay? So let's make this 8 for now, okay? And you'll see when I hit OK, so now it's still 1 second of animation, but look how big the frames are in here, because now there's only room for 8 frames in this 1 second of video, right? So if you count it off, frame 0 is obviously frame 1, and then it's like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? That's 8 frames now fit into this 1 second. This is what that means, 8 frames per second. And if I play it, you'll see this really clearly. Okay, it's all like chunky and staccato, and I actually think it looks like kind of really cool and charming this way. So, you know, you could try working at a lower frame rate, or later on in this lecture, I'm going to show you how to effectively lower the frame rate within a 2997 comp. Okay, but so that looks pretty cool. I think that looks really charming, and just for the sake of it, I'm going to hit Command K, and let's look at that at 15 frames a second, which is basically double the amount of frames per second, right? And now you can see here that the frames displayed are a little bit smaller, aka less wide. And if we count this off, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, okay? And this plays like this, right? So it's halfway between the really chunky 8 frames per second thing that we just looked at and 30 frames per second, which is what we're used to. So it's like, it's a little bit smoother, right? And that's all that means, is because literally there are more frames that it can display for every, it can display more frames per second, so it's a smoother looking video, okay? So let's now look at this, like, again at 2997. Okay, just for comparison. Now it looks pretty smooth to us, right? Like, it seems like a continuous motion, okay? And I believe that's one of the reasons why almost all, you know, film or video rates are set around the same. I mean, 24, 25, or 30, it's pretty close, right? Now let's look at this in 24, actually, and we can see what the difference is. If I just type 24 in here, we can just do it that way too. And it also looks pretty smooth. It'd be pretty hard, especially looking at this on the web, I think, to like really see a huge difference between 24 and 30. Maybe you can if you're like been working in TV for a long time, all right? So now I think you will be able to see a difference here. If I set this, if I like just crank this up to like 60, which would be about double, right? So now you can see that this is like a lot longer, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is like a lot more frames in there. And when we watch it, it's actually smoother. I think even you should be able to see this. Like the way that blue ball rolls, you don't see any like jitter at all. It just feels like super smooth, okay? So sometimes people opt to work at 60 frames a second because you can make some smooth animation with a lot of frames in it, okay? And just for the heck of it, let's see what this looks like at 120 frames per second, right? Which is a lot of frames, but again, still happening in 1 second. it almost kind of looks like it's happening slower to me now than before, right? Because there's just so many frames that your eye has to take in. I think it's a really good lesson. I think this is a really interesting way to visualize this, okay? So I hope this kind of makes sense to you guys, and we're just geeking out here, all right? So that's kind of a discussion of aspect ratio and a bunch of the presets and frame rate, okay? So that's sort of all things that you would see in this composition settings, okay? And, if you ever really want to, really check out some weird stuff, you go into this advanced, and then, there's a bunch of advanced stuff in here, like shutter angles, like if you're into photography and stuff. I don't even want to get into that stuff because it's way more advanced than we need to be here. But, After Effects is one of those things that the more you learn about it, the more there is to even know. It's pretty amazing and deep, okay? So, great. Let's now pivot and not talk so much about technical things like that, but I want to explain one of my favorite tools in After Effects that I just didn't find a good place to talk about yet, okay? And I think I just said it was one of my favorite tools. I think this is my favorite tool in After Effects, okay? And for me, it's sort of nice because my name is a little bit like this, all right? And I'm talking about null objects. And I don't know if you've ever seen this up here in Layer, New, Null Object, okay? But this is Option-Shift-Command-Y, okay? Which is... It's like mashing every button at the same time, right? But if I make a new null object, it looks like this, okay? And I will say that this is not visible on screen. This is completely a reference. And what a null object is essentially a blank layer with an anchor point on it that you can parent things to, right? It never shows up on screen. In fact, you could even just keep this off if you want, though it's nice to see where the anchor point is. And let me just say that the anchor point always with nulls defaults to the upper left, and it defaults to being in the center, in the dead center of your composition. When you create a new null, it's always that way, okay? And I think they put it in the upper left, so it's kind of sort of easier to see. I'm not quite sure exactly. You could set it to the center and set this back, but I like it leaving it like that, okay? So let me show you what nulls are really, nulls are really good for a ton of stuff, and I use them all the time in my work, okay? And, I think primarily most people think of nulls as being animation helpers. And they are. And we'll go over that. For example, you've seen this maybe in some of the homeworks, like somebody has a line of type that writes on, and then it suddenly does a big push in all of a sudden, right? And then 6 lines of type or something all scale up at the same time, right? Well, a null object is really good for that. You can basically parent all those layers to a null object and then just animate the null, right? So null objects tend to be kind of controllers or drivers of a lot of action in After Effects projects in terms of animation. But what I actually want to highlight now in terms of null objects is more the fact that they're great for housekeeping things. So let me explain what I mean by this, okay? Now, here's a typical situation where I've designed something in After Effects that has a lot of parts, okay? And they're intricate, and what I wound up doing is when I made it, for whatever reason, just say, each thing, the anchor point is kind of defaulting to be in its own center, all right? Each layer. And they're all of various sizes, scales, okay? And then, so we love the design and the client loves it, and then they say to me, okay, great, so now take it and make it smaller and stick it in the lower left. And I say, no problem, okay? And then I go and I select all my layers and I press S for scale, and I'm like, all right, let me just scale all these down. And what happens is that, okay? And because the anchor points are all in their own centers, right? And they're all of various sizes, that they scale down at different rates and into different places. And that's not what my client wants, okay? So I'm going to undo and undo that. And now to solve this, you could, okay, take this comp, housekeeping 1, right, and drop it into a new comp. And, well, yeah, I guess you'd have to, take the background off and maybe copy that there and then go back here and then paste this here, turn that back on and put it down on the bottom. And then you could take this whole layer and scale it down and put it down there in the lower left, right? But let me just tell you, there's an easier way to go, okay? And I'm going to undo that and go back to my other comp. And that is with a null object. A null object is perfect for this situation. All right, let me turn my background on and lock it again. I'm going to select all and squeeze this down. And who remembers that keyboard shortcut for null object? Nobody, because it was like a million things. It's Shift, Option, Command, and Y. new null object. And I will say there's a little bit of a correlation. So a new solid is Command Y. To edit that solid, it's Shift Command Y. And to make a new null object, it's Option Shift Command Y. And then there's another thing which is kind of like, also like a solid a little bit, called an adjustment layer that we're going to talk about next. And I believe that's just Option Command Y and not Shift Option Command Y. So this sort of Y function controls like solids, null objects, and adjustment layers. Okay, great. So now, like I said, we've made our null and it's right here in the center and the anchor point to the center. So all I have to do here is just grab all my layers except for my background and the null and parent them all to the null, right? And now I can just scale that down just like I want and move that over there. Whoops, don't do that. And move that. I grabbed this by its end and then I was kind of scaling it, so don't do that. It's probably best actually to grab null objects by their anchor point if you really want to be sure about it, okay? So, and then the really cool thing about this that I want to emphasize is once I do this, I can take my null and I can just delete it, right? And now everything stays in the same place and it's all just there now and you can just animate it however you want, okay? So that's like a great, I'm calling that a housekeeping thing because it's like sweeping up or something. It's like you made a change, but then you can take the broom and just like put it in the closet where it belongs and not deal with it again, all right? So null objects, you can use them to move things around and then you can delete them from your comp. Awesome. Now, I do want to show another example, which is a good housekeeping thing for a null, and it's related, but I just wanted to point this out. So right now I have this animation like this that I made. It's just a simple animation, okay? And just say I'm the same client. This client really loves things to be little and down to the left, okay? And they want this whole sequence of these three animated things to be smaller and in a different part of the screen, okay? Now, because it's already all animated, like, there's a way to move these things, and I can show you that. Like I've said before, if you highlight all the position keyframes and then you bring the CTI to a frame where there is a position keyframe, you can move the whole path. I've talked about this before. And you can do that with multiple layers. Now, in this case, the keyframes for position, they're all in different spots in time. So what I'd have to do is this weird workaround that I've done this a million times, is select all three of these, right, and make a kind of a dummy X position keyframe for it. In this case, I split the position into X and Y, but it's the same as regular position, in case that's confusing. And now with this dummy keyframe here, which they're all at the same moment in time, now I could select all my position keyframes for all three of these layers, okay, all the keyframes, and I'm at a keyframe in time, which is why I had to make the dummy. Now I could take those and move the motion path around, right? So I could stick them over here or whatever. And I'm not influencing the position animation. So I could put it over here and it would still work, right? So that's great, but that's a kind of an awkward workaround. You wind up with an extra keyframe. And yes, it's true, you can delete those keyframes, but yeah, that's sort of awkward. So I'm going to undo all that and undo that. And I'm going to show you that you could use a null object instead on animated objects that are already moving. And the really cool thing about the null is, like the previous example, I can scale these down and keep the ratios the same and all the position the same, which you definitely could not do just influencing these, right? So if I hit Shift Option Command Y to make a new null, right? I think that's really sinking in now. And we can take all of these, the stretchy layers, and now parent it to the null. And the same thing as before, I can take this, I can scale it, I can move it over here, I can move it over here, right? And now the animation can look like this. And that didn't take me more than a second to make those changes, right? And anytime I want, I can just do that. Now I could also, just because we talked about this before, like I could animate the null and everything else would animate with it, right? So if I hit P, oh, and I'm dying to show you this shortcut, which I haven't shown you yet, because it kind of contradicts, sort of, the idea that you have to press the stopwatch to make your first keyframes for anything. That was actually a little bit of a lie. And for all of the basic transform properties, anchor point, position, scale, and rotation, there's actually a keyboard shortcut that I haven't talked about. So if I want to make a position keyframe for this layer, I do not actually have to click on the position stopwatch. I just have to hit Option and P, okay? To make a scale keyframe here, I would hit Option and S, right? To make a rotation keyframe, Option and R. Opacity, Option and T. And you probably don't want to make an anchor point keyframe, but you could that way, all right? So for those four things, there's a shortcut. For everything else, you have to press the stopwatch, which is why I really wanted to emphasize the stopwatch thing so much at the beginning, okay? But from now on in this class, I think I'm just going to use the shortcut here, Option, or I might use Option and P or T or whatever, because that's how I'm used to animating, all right? Because it's way shorter than finding that stupid property, okay? So your teacher lied to you, deal with it. Option P, I'm gonna make a position keyframe here on my null object, and I'm gonna move forward through a bunch of this animation. And now you can see, I can take this and I can just move this over to, now I don't know what this is gonna look like, but you see that it's influencing those layers on top of their normal animation. So in this case, it looks like it puts an awkward little drift in there, which we could probably solve in some way, but I think you get my point, right? So basically housekeeping, right? Null objects can scale things with different anchor points, move things that are already animated on position and scale, right? It's a tremendous housekeeping help, and it's great for animation too, which is why I want to show you next, okay? Because there's some things that you kind of need a null object for, and this is one of them. Rolling a square, okay? This is something that is actually really tough. So I've got I called it a cube. I don't think it's actually a cube. I think it's a square, because I think a cube's a 3D object, but whatever, we'll let it stand, okay? And I've got a floor, and I've got like a background here. And what you remember, or what is probably pretty obvious, is if you want to roll a square, I moved the anchor point down here into the corner, okay? So that I can create an animation that looks like this. I'll start with it here at 0, and I'll just say I'll move 10 frames, and I will rotate this down to -90, right? Now that's like the way you'd expect a square to roll, okay? I'm gonna actually undo that for 1 sec, and I actually don't need to undo that for a sec. All I'm gonna do is take the anchor point and put it in the center of the square. Option, Command, Home, right? Didn't change my animation at all. And now when it rotates like this, and it rotates through the ground. Okay, so it's not realistic the way it looks, right? So even if we made like a position keyframe here, and like, I don't know, move this, I think I made the cube 200, so 200, yeah, something like that. So if I roll this now, I can roll it the right amount, but it still goes through the ground here. So, you might try like, oh, maybe I'll lift this up here so that it looks like it's kind of like lifting up and then dropping down, right? And then you'll notice that doesn't really work. This frame is now a little bit below the ground here, so you'd have to kind of like move that up. And then the next frame is a little bit below the ground, you have to move that up, and then so on and so forth until you're creating like a really crude kind of arc position here, so it could look like that, right? And anytime you have a situation like this where you have to have a keyframe on every frame, you're definitely not doing something in an elegant way in After Effects. This is kind of known as brute force. It's just like you have no other option and it's due 5 minutes from now and you're like, I'm going to make this thing work and I don't care if nobody can ever change it again, okay? That's a position of desperation in After Effects, and we don't like that. So, there's a way better way to roll a cube, and it just involves null objects, okay? And now, actually, I think I need to show you something first, which I forgot to mention before, which is with the keyframe down here at the corner. The reason this won't work, okay, I definitely should have mentioned this, is if it rolls to -90, okay, now I need it to roll on this corner, but the anchor point's there, right? So if I roll this anymore, it's rolling from there, and I don't want that. So what I could do is I could split the layer here, right? And then I could take this and use my pan behind tool rather, to snap that there, and then here's my animation, and then I could just copy and, oh gosh, that's even more complicated than I thought. Okay, so I take this keyframe, delete that, and I go 10 more frames. Now I have to roll it another -90, so I'd go to -180, right? Okay, so that's not too bad, right? So now I've got an animation like this. And that's definitely the way you want a square to roll. That's the way you want it to look. But splitting layer is really not ideal if you don't have to, because why? Because A, you don't want more layers in your composition because it's confusing when there's so many layers in there, right? And 2, if I want to make small changes to this, like, man, like, you know what, 10 frames for this rotation is too long or too short, and now I have to adjust these keyframes, I have to start doing it on all these different split layers, and if I want this thing to roll like 10 times, it's a pain in the butt to make all those changes, right? So I'm going to delete this one. Oops, I'm going to choose my tool and delete this one. Okay, and I'll stretch this back out. Okay, so how do we deal with this how do we deal with this, all right? Because we need the anchor point to switch, and you can't animate anchor point to switch, even with a hold keyframe. This is kind of a limited thing about anchor point, all right? So if I make a keyframe here of my anchor point, like, and actually I make it here, right? At the beginning. This is kind of where I want it. I'm going to make a hold keyframe. Then I go here, you'd think, okay, now all I need to do is choose my pan behind tool, and I'll just move the anchor point over here, right? It makes a new keyframe and everything. And then if I roll this again, it still rolls that way, right? And then if I roll this again, like go another 10 frames, and move this now, it should go like that, right? Like, and let me make this exactly -180, all right? And unfortunately, it doesn't work. The anchor point, it pretends like this is the anchor point the whole time. Look, even here back at the beginning, if I delete this, the anchor point's still there. It won't let you animate anchor point like that. It's just one of those annoying things about After Effects, okay? So we need a null object to solve this problem, all right? And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna delete this. And here I have an animation that goes from 0, this is just 2 keyframes, okay? This one's 0 and this one's -90, okay? And it just does that. And I don't want this on my layer, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna copy this and then, so Command C and then Command X and just get rid of that. But I have that copied, okay? So I'm gonna use that a bunch. So, here's my cube, and I'm gonna make a new null object. Who remembers? Anybody? No. Shift Option Command Y, okay? And obviously, if you can't remember that, it's up here. Null object, Option Shift Command Y, right? So what I'm gonna do is take my null, and I'm going to move this with my regular arrow, and I'm gonna stick this and hold Command, and I'm gonna click it right so it gets right into that corner of the cube, all right? And then I'm gonna parent the cube to the null. So far, so good. And I'm going to press R to reveal the rotation property of that null. You know what? I'm actually going to do this. This should be fine, but I'm going to move this over just a little bit. Whatever. I wanted more room. Okay? So now if you remember, I copied and pasted, or whatever, the rotation animation. So all I need to do is paste this now, and I create an animation that looks like that. I don't know why that moved over again, but whatever. Okay, so now there's my animation, and it moves over like that. And I could always, I don't know why I did that. I could always shove this back over there if I wanted. All right? And it really doesn't matter. And let me undo that because it really doesn't matter. Okay, I'm just being OCD. So now we get to the next problem, which is the one from before, which is the same, which is now it needs to roll on here. And so we can't use this null, unfortunately. So what we need to do is Shift Option Command Y. I think you're going to get this by the end of this lesson. Make a new null, okay? And we're going to take this regular arrow and click this down and make sure it's right in the corner there. Command clicking in there, okay? And now I'm going to take null 13, which was my first one, and I'm going to parent that to null 14 now, okay? And now here on the final keyframe of my rotation, or I could go like another frame or whatever, I'm going to press Command V, right? And that is my rotation, right? And now it does that, right? It has 2 rotations, right? And I think you can see where this is going, which is now if I want to make it roll on this corner, not even going to say it this time. I take this and get in closer and zoom in. Make sure you're clicking right into the center. Okay. Now, null 14 parents to null 15, and yes, you can parent as many nulls to each other as you want and create a null chain, and it'll all still work, right? So here I am, and now I will paste that there, right? Boom. Boom, boom. Oh, whoops. Boom, 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 right? And let me do this a 4th time so I can show you this real quick. Option, Shift, Command, Y. If you get anything out of this lesson, kid, you're going to get that. All right, so now it's here. Okay, and I parent this one, null 15 to null 16, and press paste, and now I've got my rolling cube, right? And, one thing I want to show about this is, with the nulls all on, you can still see them on screen here. I kind of love the way the animation looks. If you start at the beginning, oh, it's really hard to see. Let me make these like yellow. Okay, so there's my nulls. and they're lying along the ground. And as you roll forward through this, it's like this thing comes along and picks them up, right? I love the way that looks. Anyway, now the only frustrating thing about this is, unfortunately, we can't now roll this first one to create more of an animation. I mean, we could do it once, but unfortunately, because the parent chain is going the other way, these nulls here are not parented to that null is parented to this, which is parented to that. So if you want to keep this thing moving, you have to just keep making nulls and adding them on and rotating them like that, okay? So that's, a bit of a liability, but there's actually a piece of code that you can use to roll a null, and that's probably the easiest thing to do, but I'm not teaching that because that's way advanced. But what's cool about this is now I can take this and I can make adjustments to this fairly easily, right? I could do that option drag thing and pull this out, right? And now it'll just roll slower. Really slow. Or I could undo that. I could option drag and make it roll really fast. Right? Or I could very easily press F9 and put some handles, some ease on this, and now it rocks like this, right? And if you really want to, I think that's too fast. If you want to really take this one step farther, you could go into the thing I keep mentioning, which I haven't taught yet, the graph editor, which is definitely advanced, okay? And here's all my rotation, right? And what I could do is, without going too crazy on this, is I think the way this would look best is if it moves kind of quickly at first. No, sorry, the other way. It sort of takes a little bit getting off the ground, and then it hits, and it's kind of a hard hit because it's like landing there, right? So what we could do is like, right now, if I drag this handle, I'll influence the sort of the beginning of the move for all of these at the same time. So I could pull this out and make this like a slower start, and then I could push this in and make this kind of a hotter, faster land, and now it would look like this. Right? So you can get some really charming animation out of a null object if you need to, or a series of null objects, right? Null objects are my favorite. Let's just say I sometimes call myself null object. And now let's move on to talk about the final thing that we're going to talk about, and that is adjustment layers. Now, if you're familiar with Photoshop, there are adjustment layers also in Photoshop, but I think they're even cooler and more powerful in After Effects, all right? So the shortcut for an adjustment layer, as we mentioned before, is kind of similar to the null object. It's just Option Command Y, okay? So if I make a new adjustment layer, I've gone back here to my housekeeping comp, by the way, to make this point, and I'm going to actually turn off this null so we don't see it. I can actually delete the null now. And so my adjustment layer, right now an adjustment layer is also, it's like a blank layer that fills the screen, and you can put effects on it, okay? And when you put an effect on an adjustment layer, what it means is that anything below that adjustment layer in the layer stack will be affected by that effect. Anything above it will not, okay? So this is really useful sometimes. So mostly what I do is put adjustment layers on the topmost level and let it influence everything. You don't necessarily need to, and it can be useful to move it down and influence just some things. So for example, let me just say that same client of mine who I'm talking about today loves this animation, but hates the color palette I chose. They want something completely different, okay? That's the kind of thing that we could do with an adjustment layer pretty easily. So if I take my adjustment layer and I go up to Effect, and I go to my color correct effects, and I talk about hue saturation, yes, my favorite effect, I talk about it a lot. Now what I could do is, for example, I could just twirl this, and I could change this into a new color palette, right? That's a little bit ugly, but we could find something that wasn't quite as ugly, like that maybe, right? And now, like, literally, if I just turn the adjustment layer off, it looks like that, and if I turn the adjustment layer on, it looks like that. And the whole animation just looks like that now. What's even cooler about this is I could, for example, take my adjustment layer and move it over. And then it would only be influencing just, say, half the screen. Like I could put it right in the center and then turn that off. And now it looks like this, right? So it kind of like emerges from underneath this color shift or whatever. And adjustment layers can also be animated, right? So I could Option P, yeah, there I go again. And let's say I move this over till when these things are moving. To like about here. Now I could like shove my anchor point over there, right? And that could look like, I'm sorry, I said anchor point, I meant adjustment layer. anyway, it would look like that now, right? So adjustment layers could be animated, and they don't have to be full screen, and they're really useful for, just say, for example, changing all the colors of every layer before and kind of keeping it in like a really uniform tone. So that's sort of nice. If I put this back to the center, I mean, adjustment layers, you know, they can blur things. So if I go into my blur and I go to a Gaussian blur, like I can, you know, crank this up, and then like everything underneath, what you want to do with Gaussian blur, I think I forgot to mention this, by the way, in the time I talked about it, was you always want to repeat the edge pixels for that so it fills all the way to the edge of the screen. If I don't have that checked, you kind of see this like a little gap there, right? So always check that, and it'll repeat the edge pixels, right? So now, you know, it's blurred and it's color corrected, right? And it looks like that. You can see it takes a little bit longer because of the Gaussian blur. Now, just to prove this point, if I were to move this down here, now, like, these two layers are not affected by it, but this one is. So that one's blurred and has a color correct on it, but the other ones are not, right? So adjustment layers, really useful for color corrects and for affecting like everything within a layer stack. It's awesome. Plus you can move it down and affect only certain things. And you could also stack adjustment layers too. Now another really cool effect, just to get back to this, to kind of close the circle on this, all right? Getting back to this comp where I believe we left it at 120 frames per second. Yes. Okay. So now this is a really high frame rate. And I want to make an adjustment layer here and show you that adjustment layers can also be used to change the frame rate. I kind of hinted at this before. All right. So if I press Option Command Y to make a new adjustment layer, right? And I go up here to Effect, and I go down to this time, which we haven't talked about yet, and go to Posterize time. Okay, now check this out. Posterize time on an adjustment layer, when that adjustment layer is on top, it'll affect all the animation underneath. And what posterize time does is it allows you to select an alternate frame rate that this animation will play at, okay? Even though it's housed in 120 frames per second comp, for example, I could dial this down to 8, and now the animation would look like it did before when it was 8 frames per second, right? That's pretty cool. And, you know, similarly, you could now, you know, do this at 15 and it would look like that, and et cetera, et cetera. So you could set this at 30 for whatever reason, a 120 frames per second comp, and it would look kind of normal. Of course, you're asking the computer to do a lot of a kind of a jog around there, but what this means is that for each frame on screen there is basically, I think it's 4 times. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it switches. 1, 2, 3, 4, and it switches. 1, 2, 3, 4, and it switches. So it holds each frame for 4 frames, because 3 times 4 is 120. Yes, I did math. Posterized time and adjustment layers are a really cool way to take like an animation that looks kind of like smooth and turn it into something that looks kind of like stop motion-y or something, which I think could be like really charming, like I said earlier. And this way you don't have to work in an 8 frames per second comp, which could be kind of awkward. So yeah, try out adjustment layers and posterized time sometime. And yeah, so that's great. That's our lecture about Geeky AE. And even just using the expression AE is a little bit geeky. It's a huge rabbit hole, and we could go a lot geekier, and even to the point where I don't know what the heck I'm talking about, okay? So, but just to go over what we covered again, we talked all about aspect ratios and frame rates, and gone through some of the historical presets like SD and HD and NTSC and PAL and that kind of thing, which luckily we don't have to deal with now. Oh, and I wanted to show you one more thing. I'm sorry, I'm wrapping this up, I know, but I did mention this, and so I wanted to show it. If I make a new composition that's just say NTSC D1, right? Something with this pixel aspect ratio. I kind of mentioned this, but I didn't like follow through on this, right? Okay, so here we go. So this is what it used to look like. And if you were to make a, and again, right, so on a computer, there are square pixels, but on a TV back then, there were rectangular pixels. And so this preset is made to look kind of like what it looks like on a TV. So check this out. This was really my life for many years. If you made a circle in After Effects and you made it just say right in the center, I like to do that. Whoa, I did not mean to have that big stroke on there, right? But I think the keen After Effects observer will notice right away that this is a perfect circle, okay? It is literally 272 by 272. I can make this 300 by 300, right? But it doesn't look like a perfect circle. It looks kind of more like a football or an oval or something, right? And to prove this, I will show you that if we change this setting, I'm going to hit Command K, right? It's the pixel aspect ratio. If I change this to square pixels, now that's a perfect circle. Unfortunately, you could not do that. You had to animate this circle looking like that and assume that when you looked at it on a TV that it would look normal again, all right? So in the category of things that you're really glad that you're learning After Effects right now and not 20 years ago, that is definitely up there on the list. This issue with circles and things being like all the type and everything, a rectangle, just always, everything was just pulled out a little bit that way. And it was very hard to design anything, I always thought, that looked good and then kind of in your mind know that it was going to translate back to normal on a TV. But, okay, so don't go back in time and do that either. And yeah, I was wrapping this up anyway. So we talked about aspect ratios, frame rates, and then we brought in two of my very favorite things, null objects in particular, my namesake, and adjustment layers. All right. So that's a huge wealth of geeky AE information for you to stuff in your brain hole and think about from now on. Okay. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun, and I'll see you in the next video.
If you had a microscope and could look at a piece of a leaf, you would see thousands of tiny openings which branch out until the leaf has all of the materials it needs. What happens now?